US President Donald Trump says he'll be mobilizing all federal resources to suppress protests. He says the military will step in to quell growing civil unrest.
I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them. I am also taking swift and decisive action to protect our great capital, Washington, D.C. What happened in this city last night was a total disgrace. As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and the wanton destruction of property. We are putting everybody on warning. Our 7 o'clock curfew will be strictly enforced. Those who threaten innocent life and property will be arrested, detained, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I want the organizers of this terror to be on notice that you will face severe criminal penalties and lengthy sentences in jail. This includes Antifa and others who are leading instigators of this violence. One law and order, and that is what it is. One law. We have one beautiful law.
All right, so that's the U.S. President Donald Trump vowing to deploy the army, the military there. Joining us now live via Skype is a U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's in New York for us. Good afternoon to you, Sherwin. Thank you so much for coming through. So you have the president there threatening to deploy the military to states to restore order under a law that was passed in 1807. A lot of people saying that this is unlikely to bring calm to the situation. Talk to us about the implications here.
Very much, I think, important to understand in this instance, Palesa, is the moment at which President Donald Trump came out to make that announcement in the Rose Garden. You had thousands of protests, let's say hundreds of protesters, camped outside the White House in a place called Lafayette Park, where they've been protesting all week. And you had tensions on the streets of the United States. So what a lot of people were looking to the president for was him to come out and really speak to the grievances that people had in the street, while also addressing the criminality that has proliferated in cities around this country. And what you saw from this president was very much a domination, a law and order president. He referred to some of the protests, the violent protests, as domestic terrorism, and threatened to deploy the military to states using this 1807 law known as the Insurrection Act. I'll just read you a little bit about what this act says. That the U.S. federal law, Palesa, empowers the president of the United States to deploy military troops within the country in particular circumstances as to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, and rebellion. The act provides the major exception to another federal law, which would otherwise limit the use of military, the U.S. military, for law and order purposes or enforcement in the United States. So we understand from the legal experts that there are two instances at which the Insurrection Act can be used: at the request of a state governor or a state legislature, which has not happened in the state. In this case, in fact, governors around the country have repudiated this effort by the president to send the military. Or the federal government can send in the military when local law enforcement is unable to enforce federal law. And just seeing the streets of the United States, local law enforcement, state law enforcement is trying to enforce the law. So it's unclear which powers and at whose request the president will be able to impose the military on cities around this country.
So despite these threats, Sherwin, and perhaps the curfews that have been imposed in various cities across the country, we've seen looting, mayhem continuing overnight, including where you are in New York. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it was a night of rage again, and certainly not the first night. And as many people have been hoping for an improvement, certainly from a policing point of view, you know, the New York City mayor deployed double the regular number of police officers on the streets last night, from 4,000 to 8,000. They imposed a curfew at 11 p.m., but that was ignored. Iconic stores like Macy's and Herald Square have been looted. Right now, their windows, their big display windows in Manhattan have been boarded up with wooden boards to protect them from future invasions. Iconic stores along Fifth Avenue, an iconic shopping area in Manhattan, have been destroyed. Windows are smashed, and really police struggling to contain the disparity of the protests. And what this is doing, Palesa, is very much undermining the majority of protesters that are taking to the streets to grieve the death of Goerge Floyd and to grieve the injustices that have been suffered by minority communities in this country for decades. And it led to the very, very calming moment yesterday in Minneapolis, where at the area where Goerge Floyd died, it really has become a shrine to his life and his legacy. People have been very peacefully gathering there, bouquets of flowers. There's a mural of Goerge Floyd. And it also brought out his brother Terrence yesterday, who addressed the crowd, asking them to stop the protests, to stop the violence. Let's watch.
I understand y'all upset, but like it was already said, I doubt y'all half as upset as I am.
Come on now, right here, speak.
So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff,
Come on.
if I'm not over here messing up my community, come on.
That's what you're doing.
Then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing, because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
So very much, Palesa, a direct message to those agitators out there who are trying to undermine the peaceful protests. Peaceful protesters observing laws and regulations in Minneapolis overnight, in Detroit, Michigan overnight, and in parts of Atlanta overnight that previously had been scenes of violence as well. So that message certainly having an effect, not as widespread, certainly, as authorities would hope.
So let's just reflect a bit on the two postmortems, one by the medical examiner's office and the other one by an independent pathologist appointed by the family. Both these postmortems have found that Goerge Floyd died by homicide, but they differ in some of the key details. If you could just talk to us about the disparities there, Sherwin.
Yeah, you're quite right. There are some key differences in the findings. They both find that a homicide took place, Palesa, essentially that a human being killed another human being. Intent, of course, is something that will have to be proven in court. But the county medical examiner, which is appointed by the local government, say that Floyd died of cardiopulmonary arrest associated sort of with a heart attack. Death caused by asphyxiation, by pointing to possible, also they pointed to possible underlying conditions and intoxicants that were in his system, including methamphetamines in the system that they believe are contributing factors to the death of Goerge Floyd. The independent autopsy done at the auspices of the family, who were not happy with the findings of the Hennepin County medical examiner, they say he died of asphyxiation. Let's listen to one of the doctors, Dr. Michael Baden, one of the independent pathologists who conducted that second autopsy.
The cause of death, in my opinion, is asphyxia due to compression of the neck, which, as Mr. Crump indicated, can interfere with blood flow and oxygen going to the brain, and compression of the back, which interferes with breathing. When he said, "I can't breathe," unfortunately, many police are under the impression if you can talk, that means you're breathing. That is not true.
So that pathologist, Palesa, pointing to pressure on the neck and the back, which made it hard for George Floyd to breathe. He referred to scrapes on his face, indicating the force that was used to press him down to the ground. And of course, this finding will have implications for the other 3 officers that have not been arrested. In fact, this is a fundamental call of the peaceful protesters we are seeing. They want justice, not just for Derek Sherwin, who's been arrested, the former police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck, but the other 2 officers that also held him down. The police chief in Minneapolis this week saying that Mr. Floyd died in our hands, and I see that as being complicit. If there was one solitary voice that would have intervened, that's what I would have hoped for. So the police chief saying that he believes those officers are culpable. The autopsy now also pointing in that direction. So one would expect that those 3 officers will be arrested and charged soon.
All right, so there could be more implications on this particular case. But quickly, Sherwin, the former President Barack Obama also released a lengthy op-ed yesterday, briefly telling us what his message was, please.
Yeah, Joe Biden also, the vice president, who's the Democratic nominee, spoke a short time ago. I'll briefly tell you what he said. He said this was a country crying for leadership, leadership that brings us together, leadership that can recognize pain. Of course, this is the likely nominee to face President Trump in the election in November. President Obama, in a lengthy op-ed yesterday, Palesa says it's going to take a new generation of activists to shape strategies that best fit the times. He called protests a genuine representation of frustration over decades-long failures to reform police practices and the criminal justice system, but in the same breath, giving weight to the need for change in this country based on what peaceful protesters are doing, but also criticizing the vandalism and looting and saying that there's no place for that, particularly as we grieve the death of George Floyd.
All right, that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you so much for coming through. Our U.S. correspondent there, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us live from New York.